Mr Farquhar took his leave. That evening there was a long conference, for, as it happened, Ruth was at home. She was strenuously against the school plan. She could see no advantages that would counterbalance the evil which she dreaded from any school for Leonard, namely, that the good opinion and regard of the world would assume too high an importance in his eyes. The very idea seemed to produce in her so much shrinking affright, that by mutual consent the subject was dropped, to be taken up again or not, according to circumstances. Mr Farquhar wrote the next morning on Mr Benson's behalf to the insurance company to inquire about the bonus. Although he wrote in the usual formal way, he did not think it necessary to tell Mr Bradshaw what he had done, for Mr Benson's name was rarely mentioned between the partners. Each had been made fully aware of the views which the other entertained on the subject that had caused the estrangement, and Mr Farquhar felt that no external argument could affect Mr Bradshaw's resolved disapproval and avoidance of his former minister. As it happened, the answer from the insurance company, directed to the firm, was given to Mr Bradshaw along with the other business letters. It was to the effect that Mr Benson's shares had been sold and transferred above a 12-month ago, which sufficiently accounted for the circumstance that no notification of the bonus had been sent to him. Mr Bradshaw tossed the letter on one side, not displeased to have a good reason for feeling a little contempt at the unbusinesslike forgetfulness of Mr Benson, at whose insistence some one had evidently been writing to the insurance company. On Mr Farquhar's entrance, he expressed this feeling to him. "Really," he said, "these dissenting ministers have no more notion of exactitude in their affairs than a child. The idea of forgetting that he had sold his shares, and applying for the bonus, when it seems he has transferred them only a year ago." Mr Farquhar was reading the letter while Mr Bradshaw spoke. "I don't quite understand it," said he. "Mr Benson was quite clear about it. He could not have received his half-yearly dividends unless he had been possessed of these shares; and I don't suppose dissenting ministers, with all their ignorance of business, are unlike other men in knowing whether or not they receive the money that they believe to be owing to them." "I should not wonder if they were if Benson was, at any rate. Why, I never knew his watch to be right in all my life. It was always too fast or too slow. It must have been a daily discomfort to him. It ought to have been. Depend upon it, his money matters are just in the same irregular state. No accounts kept, I'll be bound." "I don't see that follows," said Mr Farquhar, half amused. "That watch of his is a very curious one. Belonged to his father and grandfather, I don't know how far back. And the sentimental feelings which he is guided by prompt him to keep it, to the inconvenience of himself and every one else." Mr Farquhar gave up the subject of the watch as hopeless. "But about this letter. I wrote, at Mr Benson's desire, to the insurance office, and I am not satisfied with this answer. All the transaction has passed through our hands. I do not think it is likely Mr Benson would write and sell the shares without, at any rate, informing us at the time, even though he forgot all about it afterwards. Probably he told Richard or Mr Watson. We can ask Mr Watson at once. I am afraid we must wait till Richard comes home, for I don't know where a letter would catch him." Mr Bradshaw pulled the bell that rang into the head clerk's room, saying as he did so, "You may depend upon it, Farquhar, the blunder lies with Benson himself. He is just the man to muddle away his money in indiscriminate charity, and then to wonder what has become of it." Mr Farquhar was discreet enough to hold his tongue. "Mr Watson," said Mr Bradshaw, as the old clerk made his appearance, "here is some mistake about those insurance shares we purchased for Benson 10 or a dozen years ago." He spoke to Mr Farquhar about some bonus they are paying to the shareholders, it seems, and in reply to Mr Farquhar's letter, the insurance company say the shares were sold 12 months since. Have you any knowledge of the transaction? Has the transfer passed through your hands? By the way," turning to Mr Farquhar, "who kept the certificates? Did Benson or we?" "I really don't know," said Mr Farquhar. "Perhaps Mr Watson can tell us." Mr Watson meanwhile was studying the letter. When he had ended it, he took off his spectacles, wiped them, and replacing them, he read it again. "It seems very strange, sir," he said at length, with his trembling, aged voice, "for I paid Mr Benson the account of the dividends myself last June, and got a receipt in form, and that is since the date of the alleged transfer." "Pretty nearly 12 months after it took place," said Mr Farquhar. "How did you receive the dividends? An order on the bank, along with old Mrs Cranmer's?" asked Mr Bradshaw sharply. "I don't know how they came. Mr Richard gave me the money, and desired me to get the receipt." "It's unlucky Richard is from home," said Mr Bradshaw. "He could have cleared up this mystery for us." Mr Farquhar was silent. "Do you know where the certificates were kept, Mr Watson?" said he. "I'll not be sure, but I think they were with Mrs Cranmer's papers and deeds, in box A24. I wish old Cranmer would have made any other man his executor. She, too, is always coming with some unreasonable request or other." "Mr Benson's inquiry about his bonus is perfectly reasonable, at any rate." Mr Watson, who was dwelling in the slow fashion of age on what had been said before, now spoke. "I'll not be sure, but I am almost certain, Mr Benson said, when I paid him last June, that he thought he ought to give the receipt on a stamp, and had spoken about it to Mr Richard the time before, but that Mr Richard said that it was of no consequence. Yes," continued he, gathering up his memory as he went on, "he did, I remember now, and I thought to myself that Mr Richard was but a young man. Mr Richard will know all about it." "Yes," said Mr Farquhar gravely. "I shan't wait till Richard's return," said Mr Bradshaw. "We can soon see if the certificates are in the box Watson points out. If they are there, the insurance people are no more fit to manage their concern than that cat, and I shall tell them so. If they are not there, as I suspect will prove to be the case, it is just forgetfulness on Benson's part, as I have said from the first." "You forget the payment of the dividends," said Mr Farquhar in a low voice. "Well, sir, what then?" said Mr Bradshaw abruptly. While he spoke, while his eye met Mr Farquhar's, the hinted meaning of the latter flashed through his mind, but he was only made angry to find that such a suspicion could pass through anyone's imagination. "I suppose I may go, sir," said Watson respectfully, an uneasy consciousness of what was in Mr Farquhar's thoughts troubling the faithful old clerk. "Yes, go. What do you mean about the dividends?" asked Mr Bradshaw impetuously of Mr Farquhar. "Simply, I think there can have been no forgetfulness, no mistake on Mr Benson's part," said Mr Farquhar, unwilling to put his dim suspicion into words. "Then, of course, it is some blunder of that confounded insurance company. I will write to them to day, and make them a little brisker and more correct in their statements." "Don't you think it would be better to wait till Richard's return? He may be able to explain it." "No, sir," said Mr Bradshaw sharply. "I do not think it would be better. It has not been my way of doing business to spare anyone or any company the consequences of their own carelessness, nor to obtain information second hand, when I could have it direct from the source. I shall write to the insurance office by the next post." Mr Farquhar saw that any further remonstrance on his part would only aggravate his partner's obstinacy, and besides, it was but a suspicion, an uncomfortable suspicion. It was possible that some of the clerks at the insurance office might have made a mistake. Watson was not sure, after all, that the certificates had been deposited in box A 24; and when he and Mr